One of the defining conflicts of the 21st century, World War II, was a colossal clash of world powers that utterly devastated most of the world while giving rise to modern superpowers. The conflict was mainly defined as a struggle between the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and Imperial Japan, and the Allies, Great Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. The war began with the German blitzkrieg into Poland on September 1st, 1939. The war raged in Europe with the conquest of the continent by the Nazis and Italy. The European Axis powers dominated France and constantly bombarded England with air raids. In the Far East, Japan carved out an empire, sweeping into Asia and the Pacific, utterly decimating any resistance. They displayed their dominance in horrific attacks against native peoples. In the rape of Nanking, the Japanese brutally slaughtered anyone that they could find in the city, striking fear in the hearts of all the emperor's enemies. Prospects were bleak for the Allies. However, on one Sunday morning in December, Japan set its sights on what was its greatest enemy. Greatly angered by a trade embargo from the United States and focused on creating an empire that spanned the Pacific Ocean, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a sneak attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Japanese succeeded in crippling the Pacific Fleet, but in doing so, they had pulled the United States into the war. Working with their allies in Europe, the United States decided their first goal was to put an end to the Axis powers' reign of terror in Europe. In the largest amphibious assault in history, the Allies invaded the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. This was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and, with the invasion of Sicily and the end of Mussolini's Italy, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered, and the European theater of war had come to a close. However, the land of the rising sun still posed a threat in the Pacific. War raged in the Pacific until the turning point in the theater, the Battle of Midway. The Japanese naval presence in the Pacific was crippled, and the Allies' advance into the Japanese Empire was swift. They took up the strategy of island hopping, destroying Japanese presence in every island that they could find in the Pacific. The Allies made it as far as Okinawa before preparing for an all-out assault on the mainland. If the Allies went ahead with their plan of attack, the attack would be drawn out and many lives would be lost. There was an alternative, though. The United States had a weapon of mass destruction brought about by the efforts of some of the greatest minds in the world in the Manhattan Project. U.S. President Harry Truman ultimately decided to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the devastation caused led to the surrender of Japan and the end of the Second World War.
The United States, in a show of diplomacy and solidarity, agreed to end the embargo on Japan on Saturday, December 6, 1941. Within months, Japan was a new Pacific power as they swept through China, Korea, and Southeast Asia, and brutally massacred all who stood in their path. Japan's new resources enabled them to extend their empire further than ever, and on April 29, 1943, a day of special significance as it was Emperor Hirohito's birthday, Japan invaded Russia even as Russia just defeated the Germans at Stalingrad about 2 months earlier. Meanwhile, Germany had been dealt a crushing defeat in the Battle of Britain and resorted to reinforcing their borders against the inevitable Russian attack, and pouring more resources into their newly won territorial acquisitions and campaign in northern Africa. With the United States no longer a threat to them, as it had not joined the war and developed an isolationist stance since, Hitler meanwhile continued his plans in the Holocaust, and it is estimated more than 95% of the Jews in the German Empire died, most from overwork to complete Hitler's grandiose dreams of a utopian future. Meanwhile, Britain, tired of fighting due to a lack of progress and an increasingly unhappy civilian populace, negotiated a peace treaty with Germany on June 5, 1944, and exited the war while maintaining almost all territory. With the British no longer straining their western border, Germany was ready when Russia finally did reach the borders, and with Japan invading in the east and Germany inflicting massive casualties on the west, Russia had overextended itself in a two-front war and was defeated on May 7, 1945. World War II was over.
Russia was eventually divided into two territories, East Russia, controlled by Japan, and West Russia, controlled by Germany. In both territories, the conquerors treated the Russians with extreme prejudice and brutality. Meanwhile, despite Japan and Germany's overwhelming power, the United States remained an untouched isolationist state, as they had announced the successful test of the first nuclear bomb, and it was recognized that Japan and Germany could not compete with this new weapon. they instead opting to sign a series of non-aggression pacts with the United States between 1946 and 1948. The communist dream of a united utopian world was crushed as both Hitler's Germany and Japan despised not only the Russian race, but the entire Communist Manifesto. It was declared an outlawed book, and all remaining copies were lost forever. However, a new battle of ideologies took the place of communism versus capitalism. The fascist economic policies of a government-controlled system were pitted against Japan's capitalist ideals in order to undermine the Germans' acquisition of raw material in developing countries. The Japanese undertook secretive measures and subterfuge and sabotage in order to hinder the fascist machine. The United States, just barely crawling out of a colossal depression, received massive financial aid from the Japanese in order to create an ally against fascism in 1965. The United States and Japan signed a defensive pact and created a massive trans-Pacific trade system in which small islands around the Pacific became massively modernized and sources of industry. Along with the massive economic output being created by the trans-Pacific trade, the U.S., confident in their non-aggression pact, shared their secrets of the atomic bomb with the Japanese. Japan, after constructing a stockpile of their own, advertised their strength to the Nazis and expected them to crack on their threat of atomic weapons. However, the Nazi scientists had been experimenting with atomic weapons since the Second World War and had fashioned their own. Both sides began rapidly producing WMDs, and it seemed like either side was poised to plunge the world into war. In 1985, though, outraged at what his creation had done to the world, Robert Oppenheimer and the other scientists behind the Manhattan Project televised a speech of what could happen if the powers resorted to the use of atomic weapons and begged them to disarm and go back to life before the fear of war. Both the Japanese Americans and the Germans decided that scientists were right, and they agreed to disarm roughly 60% of their respective stockpiles. The world narrowly evaded atomic war, and humanity persisted.
This future, strangely parallel to our own, is unimaginable, impossible to conceive in this modern day. Yet this plausible outcome would have made its way into the history books if only America had not ended the embargo and the Japanese had not attacked.